Okay, in this video, we're going to look at some advanced techniques to use Virtuoso's natural language programming to be able to author steps against Dynamics 365. But when we're looking at different types of elements. So in previous videos, we looked at how to interact with form fields using, let's say, the title of the form field and then various click and write actions. But then what happens if I want to interact, let's say, with icons, which don't actually have a name? So for example, if I want to click on, let's say, this bulb icon, how would I do that? So let's go and look and put in a new checkpoint, so interacting with icons, for example. Now in Virtuoso, what you have access to in the advanced mode here is the dev tools, which basically show you the structure of how the page is built, and it kind of gives you more details about all of the elements. Don't worry about this sort of being technical if you've never seen this before, because we'll sort of show you how easy it is still to use. So by clicking on this little inspect icon, I could hover over the little bulb here, and then what I can see is that this is highlighting in here the structure. So you can see as I hover over this, it's highlighting that element, so it's blue. And what we see actually is in the background there are some labels and titles. And what I'd really be looking for here ideally is, for example, here we have a thing called the area label, which is, it's called assistant. So basically in the background in the page, there's a label for that icon which is called assistant. So if I just copy that and then say click and then literally write assistant, then you can see it's now gone and interacted with that element and it's opened the sidebar for me. So that's just a simple way that you can actually use details contained in the background of the page through the dev tools to be able to find something that's still natural language. And similarly that if I wanted to come and click and close the assistant with the X, again I could just hover over this, and if I just scroll up you can see this is called close assistant. So then I could say click close assistant, for example, and it will go ahead and as you see it's closed the box. So in that way you can really go through toggling on or off that dev tools, and for any of these icons you can see if I go over the cog here, then I can also see that this has got a title of settings, or it's got some additional details. For instance, I could pretty much use any of these, like personal settings launcher if I wanted. So let's go and say click personal settings launcher, and it's gone and interacted with that element. And then if I wanted to get rid of that box, then I could, let's say, press escape, and that's a way of closing that box. So you can see there I used a key press to be able to perform an action. So some simple ways to interact with, let's say, non-labeled icons, and including putting some keyboard presses just as a user would. Okay, in exactly the same way, let's look at just a neat means to be able to interact with where we've got, so for instance here, these are unique elements. I don't see any other icons that look the same on the page. But then what about when we've got, let's say, this little drop down arrow here? I can see there are actually multiples. So if I went in and hovered over that through the dev tools, and I can see that this has within it, it doesn't seem to have a unique label, but then I might look for, it could be a class, for example. So symbol font drop down arrow symbol. It's kind of the simplest thing I can see in there to identify it. It's very likely that if I looked at these other similar drop-down icons, they would have the same class. Therefore, how can I tell Virtuoso that I want to click this one here? So what I can actually do then, I could say, look for open leads, because that's the section of the page I want to go into. I could then say, look for modified on, because that's next to where the drop-down arrow is. And then I could use this class and I could say, click, use the class name. And when I do that, you'll see it's gone and interacted with that little drop-down there. Now what I could do is that's not very necessarily readable. I mean, I can see in the screenshot when I go in here, I can tell what was interacted, so somebody can always tell what you meant by that. But what you could do is give this an alias. So by clicking on the step and going to the step editor, I could give this an alias, a more sort of natural language way of doing it, and call that drop down arrow. And you can see that that's given it a kind of white outline with a dotted outline, which tells us that's an alias, but that's not the hint we used. We can see that the hint was, in this case, the class name. Okay, so that's another means to be able to locate and interact with a common element by using a combination of context with looking for and then clicking on the drop-down arrow. Okay, but then what about some common things? So we looked at previously in another video how to interact with form fields. But what about, for example, drop-downs? So let's go ahead and create an order. So let's go and look for my work. So that's because that's in the sidebar. So we're just telling Virtuoso to look over here. And then we're going to click on orders. So let's click orders. And by doing that, it goes ahead and interacts with the orders. Great. So now we're on the orders page. We could then say, wait for my orders. So that just puts a dynamic wait in, remember, to be able to let the page load. And then we can say, click new, which will then load up a new order screen. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to interact with the drop-down field to show the way that you can do that. So I know that if I scroll down here, I know the payment terms is a drop-down field. So first I'm going to go and say click payment terms, which will activate that field. And then what I can do is I could use the DevTools here to be able to click on the box, and you can see it's showing me, because this is highlighted, this is the, if you like, the background code for that drop-down. And it shows me in here the different options. So either select, net 30, 2% 10, net 30, net 45. So because of that, what I could do is I could choose this option, net 30. So then I could say pick net 30 from payment terms. So basically it's kind of like you would do as if you're doing this manually, and you can see there it's gone and picked net 30. So that's given you some examples of just how to start to interact with different elements. And bear in mind, if we go back and in the pack that you can load in to your instance of Virtuoso, we do have a journey here that shows you how to interact with various elements. Bear in mind, this runs on the Dynamics 365 Sales Professional module, but it does give you some examples with comments of how to interact with different elements that you can refer to. Otherwise, this is an illustration of the way that natural language programming can be used easily against either form fields or text-based elements or icons or common elements. Just starts to give you an insight into how you can really start creating powerful tests on Dynamics 365 using our codeless test automation.